The afternoon sun filters through the barred windows of New Bilibid prison in Manila. It's September 2nd, 1945. The war ended formally yesterday aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. But here, in this sweltering concrete cell block, Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita knows that for him, the war is just beginning. He sits on a narrow cot, back straight despite exhaustion, despite hunger, despite the knowledge of what comes next. Outside his cell, American voices echo sharp commands, boots on concrete, the metallic clang of keys. Yamashita has been a soldier for 39 years. He knows these sounds. The sounds of men preparing something final. The cell door opens without warning. An American military policeman stands in the frame, his face carefully neutral. Behind him, another MP, hand resting on his holstered sidearm. Through an interpreter barely older than 20, the MP speaks. "General Yamashita, you will come with us." Yamashita rises. His uniform, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, hangs loose on his frame. 63 days of captivity, 63 days of sparse rations, of interrogations, of waiting. He adjusts what remains of his dignity and follows the MPs into the corridor. 2 cells down, they stop again. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa emerges older than Yamashita, greyer, his eyes carrying the weight of 4 years since Bataan. Further down the corridor, a third general joins them. The guards say nothing about where they're going. In Yamashita's experience, executioners rarely explain themselves. They walk through the prison compound, out into the Manila evening. The city still bears the scars of its liberation buildings, gutted by fire, streets cratered by artillery, the acrid smell of destruction that lingers months after the guns fall silent. 3 Japanese generals, flanked by armed American soldiers, walking toward an unknown destination. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yamashita expects a courtroom. He expects a firing squad assembled in some dusty yard. He expects the machinery of American justice, which he knows will be swift and final. What he does not expect, what none of them expect, is an invitation to dinner. But understanding this moment requires stepping back, understanding who these men were, what they had done, and why the simple act of sharing a meal would become one of the strangest episodes in the aftermath of the Pacific War. Tomoyuki Yamashita earned his reputation in 1942 during the Malayan Campaign. In 70 days, his 25th Army swept down the Malayan Peninsula and captured Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress in Southeast Asia. He did it with inferior numbers, using bicycles, and captured British equipment, exploiting every weakness in the British defensive strategy. Winston Churchill called the fall of Singapore the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. 85,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops surrendered to Yamashita's force of roughly 36,000 men. Overnight, Yamashita became the Tiger of Malaya, one of Japan's most celebrated commanders. But military genius and moral culpability are not opposites. They can coexist in the same man, in the same campaign, creating impossible puzzles for those who come after. In October 1944, Yamashita was transferred to the Philippines to command the 14th Area Army, Japan's last major defensive force in the islands. By this point in the war, the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. American forces were returning to the Philippines with overwhelming superiority in men, ships, aircraft, and materiel. Yamashita understood mathematics. His mission was not to win, but to delay, to tie down American forces for as long as possible, buying time, for the defense of the Japanese home islands. He deployed his forces across Luzon, avoiding concentrations that could be destroyed by American air power. He moved his headquarters into the mountains of northern Luzon, away from Manila, and he gave explicit orders regarding the capital. Manila was not to be defended. The city was to be declared open, its infrastructure preserved, its civilian population spared the devastation of urban warfare. These orders are documented. They exist in captured Japanese communications, in testimony from surviving staff officers, in the meticulous records the Americans compiled during the occupation. Yamashita wanted to fight his delaying campaign in the mountains, where terrain favored the defender and American mechanized forces would bog down. Manila, he believed, was indefensible and not worth the cost in civilian lives. But in war, orders are not always followed, and in the Imperial Japanese military of 1945, the fractures between services had become chasms. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi commanded the Manila Naval Defense Force, approximately 16,000 naval personnel trapped in the city as American forces approached. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated under different command structures, different doctrines, different honor codes than the army. Iwabuchi did not answer Yamashita. More importantly, he did not agree with Yamashita's strategy. To Iwabuchi, abandoning Manila without a fight was unthinkable. It violated every principle of Bushido, every teaching about Japanese martial spirit, every promise made to the emperor. If the Americans wanted Manila, they would have to take it room by room, building by building, at a cost that would make them question their entire Philippines campaign. On February 3, 1945, American forces entered Manila's outskirts. Iwabuchi ordered his men to fight to the last. He also ordered something else, something that transformed the battle for Manila from a military engagement into one of the worst urban atrocities of the Pacific War. For 30 days, as American troops fought their way into the city, Japanese forces systematically massacred Filipino civilians. Hospitals were burned with patients inside. The Red Cross headquarters was attacked, its nurses raped and killed. Entire neighborhoods were leveled, their inhabitants machine-gunned in the streets or herded into buildings that were then set ablaze. The methods were deliberate, systematic. Families were tied together and bayoneted. Women and girls were gang-raped before execution. Children were killed in front of their parents. The Bayview Hotel massacre, the Ermita district killings, the De La Salle College atrocity. The list runs for pages in the later war crimes documentation. When American forces finally secured Manila on March 3, 1945, they found a city in ruins. An estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians were dead more than died in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, was the second most devastated Allied capital of World War II, after Warsaw. And 60 miles north, fighting a different battle in the mountains of Luzon, Tomoyuki Yamashita learned what had happened through fragmentary reports and captured American broadcasts. His orders had been ignored. His strategy had been abandoned, and now his name would be forever linked to a massacre he neither ordered nor witnessed. This is the man sitting in that Manila cell on September 2, 1945. Not simply a defeated general, but a commander waiting to be held accountable for atrocities committed by forces technically under his command but practically beyond his control. Masaharu Homa's burden is different but equally heavy. In April 1942, Homa commanded the Japanese forces that captured the Philippines from American and Filipino defenders. General Douglas MacArthur had already evacuated to Australia, leaving behind roughly 75,000 American and Filipino troops on the Bataan Peninsula. When they surrendered on April 9, 1942, they became the largest group of American prisoners taken in a single action in U.S. military history. What followed became known as the Bataan Death March. The Japanese were unprepared for the sheer number of prisoners. Their logistics had been stretched thin by months of fighting. They had insufficient food, medicine, or transportation. The original plan was to move the prisoners by truck and rail to a camp at Camp O'Donnell, roughly 65 miles north. But there weren't enough trucks, the rail line was damaged, and Japanese military culture, which viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor, had no framework for treating enemy prisoners with dignity. So they marched, in tropical heat, without adequate water, without medical care, under the supervision of guards who viewed them as contemptible cowards. Men who fell out of line were bayoneted or shot. Those too sick or weak to continue were left to die by the roadside. Some were beheaded for attempting to drink from streams. Others were simply clubbed to death for moving too slowly. The exact death toll remains disputed. Conservative estimates suggest between 5,000 and 11,000 men died during the march and in the immediate aftermath at Camp O'Donnell. Some estimates run higher. American and Filipino survivors testified to systematic brutality, to casual murder, to a complete breakdown of even the minimal standards expected in the treatment of prisoners of war. Homer, like Yamashita, would later claim he did not order these atrocities. He would testify that his subordinates acted without his knowledge or authorization. He would present evidence that he was dealing with other operational concerns while the march took place. He would argue that the breakdown in prisoner treatment resulted from logistical failure and the actions of individual soldiers, not from command policy. But he was the commanding general. The prisoners were his responsibility. And in the calculus of post-war justice, ignorance would not prove an adequate defense. By September 1945, Homer had had months to contemplate his fate. He knows what Americans call the Bataan Death March. He knows the survivors' testimonies. He knows that the tribunal will not be interested in his intentions, only in his results. The third general's name is less prominent in the historical record. He commanded forces implicated in various atrocities, the burning of villages, the execution of suspected guerrillas, the systematic abuse of civilian populations in occupied territories. His crimes are documented but less spectacular, buried in the mass of war crimes tribunals that would eventually process hundreds of Japanese officers and officials. 3 men, 3 cells. 3 careers built on military victory now ending in cells in a devastated city, waiting for American justice. They have all written letters, home letters that may never arrive, letters saying goodbye to families they will likely never see again. They have made their peace with death. In the Japanese military tradition, there is a protocol for this. A ritual suicide seppuku would have been the honorable path, but the Americans have taken their swords and removed the means. So they wait for the Americans to do what they cannot do themselves. What they cannot imagine is that before the trials, before the verdicts, before the inevitable sentences, an American would extend to them an act of simple, inexplicable humanity. The American occupation of Manila in September 1945 exists in a strange liminal space. The war is over, but the hatred remains. The machinery of justice is assembling prosecutors, gathering evidence, witnesses giving depositions, military lawyers drafting charges, but it moves slowly, deliberately, under the weight of establishing precedents that will shape international law for generations. Meanwhile, thousands of Japanese prisoners sit in camps and cells across the Pacific, waiting. Some are common soldiers, conscripts who followed orders and are now simply waiting to be repatriated. Others are officers, men whose names appear in war crimes files, whose commands are linked to specific atrocities, whose fates will be decided in courtrooms. The American forces occupying Manila represent a cross-section of the United States. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, college-educated officers and men who barely finished high school. Some have seen combat brutal, close quarters fighting in jungles and on beaches where the only rule was survival. Others arrived after the shooting stopped, part of the vast administrative apparatus needed to occupy and rebuild a shattered archipelago. Among these occupation forces was a man whose first name has been lost to most official records, but whose last name appears in fragmentary accounts, Russell. His rank varied in different retellings. Some sources suggest he was a sergeant, others a junior officer, still others a warrant officer assigned to administrative duties. What remains consistent across accounts is his occupation before the war. He was a farmer from somewhere in the American Midwest. Russell had seen combat. The exact unit and actions are unclear, but post-war interviews with men who knew him suggest he'd been through the Philippines campaign, possibly the liberation of Manila itself, possibly the fighting in northern Luzon. He'd seen what war did to cities and to people. He'd seen American bodies left to rot in the jungle. He'd seen the aftermath of Japanese atrocities against Filipino civilians. He had every reason to hate the men sitting in New Bilibid prison. But Russell had also been raised in a culture that valued certain principles: hospitality, even to enemies, the belief that mercy was a strength, not a weakness, the idea that a man's character was revealed not in how he treated his friends, but in how he treated those who couldn't fight back. In late August or early September 1945, the exact date is unrecorded, Russell approached his commanding officer with an unusual request. He wanted to invite the 3 Japanese generals to his quarters for dinner. The request moved up the chain of command, generating confusion at every level. Junior officers assumed it was a joke. Senior officers worried about security implications. The military police raised concerns about fraternization with war criminals. Legal officers questioned whether it might compromise future prosecutions. But somewhere in that chain, someone approved it. Perhaps they were curious about what would happen. Perhaps they believed that showing humanity to the enemy would demonstrate American values. Perhaps they simply saw no harm in one meal before the inevitable trials began. The approval came with conditions. Armed guards would accompany the generals. The dinner would be monitored. Any conversation would be subject to later review. But yes, Sergeant or Lieutenant or Warrant Officer Russell could invite 3 Japanese generals accused of war crimes to his quarters for a meal. The invitation was delivered to Yamashita's cell by an MP, speaking through an interpreter. The interpreter, a young Nisei second-generation Japanese-American chosen for language skills and presumed loyalty, delivered the message with visible discomfort. General Yamashita, you have been invited to dinner tomorrow evening. An American soldier wishes to offer you a meal at his quarters. Yamashita, sitting on his cot, looked up sharply. In Japanese, he asked, "What is the purpose of this dinner?" The interpreter conferred with the MP, then replied, "No purpose is stated, sir. Just dinner." After the MP and interpreter left, Yamashita sat in silence, trying to parse the meaning. In Japanese military culture, every gesture carries layers of significance. A formal dinner could be a prelude to execution, the condemned man's last meal. a ritual acknowledgement of warrior status even in defeat, or it could be something else entirely. He thought of the Chinese military classics he'd studied at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. Sun Tzu wrote about knowing your enemy, but this wasn't interrogation. The Americans had already questioned him extensively. They had his operational orders, his communications logs, his staff officers' testimonies. They knew everything he could tell them about the Philippines campaign. So what was this? In the adjacent cell, Homer received the same invitation. His reaction, according to later accounts, was immediate suspicion. "It's a trap," he told his interpreter. "They want us to relax, to say something they can use against us in the trial." The third general said nothing when informed, simply nodded his acceptance. That evening, the three generals conferred as best they could, through the walls separating their cells. None of them could explain the invitation. None of them could see the strategic purpose. But all three understood they had no choice but to accept. Refusal would be interpreted as cowardice, fear, or worse, as an acknowledgement of guilt. If this was to be their last meal, they would face it as Japanese officers, with whatever dignity remained to them. The next evening, as the sun began its descent over Manila Bay, 3 Japanese generals were escorted from their cells. They had been permitted to clean their uniforms as best as possible, water and a brush, nothing more. Their swords remained confiscated. A Japanese officer's sword is not merely a weapon but a symbol of his soul, his connection to warrior tradition stretching back centuries. To walk without it is to walk incomplete, emasculated. 4 American MPs accompanied them through the prison compound, out a side gate, and into the streets of Manila. Even in the evening coolness, the city smells of destruction, burnt wood, decomposing concrete, the sweet rot odor that lingers where many people have died. Filipinos on the street stop and stare. Some faces show anger, others mere curiosity. None show sympathy. The walk is perhaps 15 minutes. Russell's quarters are in a requisitioned house, not a mansion, but a solid structure that survived the battle for Manila relatively intact. 2-story Spanish colonial architecture, stucco walls pocked by shrapnel, roof tiles missing in patches, the kind of middle-class home that represented Manila's pre-war prosperity. At the door, an American soldier stands guard. He checks the MP's credentials, nods, and opens the door. Inside, the house is sparsely furnished but clean. Military efficiency has replaced whatever civilian comfort once existed here. The dining room table, however, has been set with care. Real plates, ceramic, not metal mess kits, glasses for water, cloth napkins, silverware arranged properly. It looks less like a military installation and more like someone's home. Russell stands when they enter. He's in his Class A uniform, pressed, medals aligned, brass polished. Not dress blues, but the formal service uniform that indicates official occasion. He's perhaps 30 years old, though war ages men in ways that transcend mere years. His face is weathered, crow's feet etched around eyes that have seen too much. But those eyes are not hard. They're evaluating, yes, but not hostile. He does not salute. These men are prisoners, not dignitaries. But he bows a slight, awkward bow, the kind a man who's never studied Japanese customs might attempt after watching others. It's not perfect, but it's sincere. Through the interpreter, "General Yamashita, General Homer, General, welcome to my home. Please, sit." The formality of the invitation, delivered in Japanese through translation, carries weight. Not "you prisoners" or "you war criminals." The rank is acknowledged. The courtesy is extended. Yamashita, trained in protocol at the Army War College, makes a decision in that instant. He returns the bow deeper than Russell's, acknowledging his position as defeated enemy, as prisoner, as supplicant. Then he moves to the table and sits. Homer and the third general follow. Russell waits until all three are seated, then sits himself. For a moment, silence hangs in the room. The MPs stand by the walls, hands near weapons, watching. The interpreter sits to one side, ready to translate, and 4 men, 3 Japanese generals and 1 American farmer in uniform occupy a dining table in a conquered city where 30,000 people died 6 months earlier. Russell breaks the silence. "Gentlemen, I hope you'll forgive the simplicity of the meal. I've done my best with what's available." The interpreter translates. Yamashita nods acknowledgement. What Russell serves would be ordinary by American standards pot roast, the kind of meal his wife probably cooked on Sunday afternoons back in Iowa or Nebraska. Beef roasted with onions and carrots, potatoes cooked in the drippings, bread with butter, coffee that actually smells like coffee. But for men who've been eating prison rations for months, thin rice gruel, occasional vegetables, protein so rare its appearance marks special days, the smell alone is overwhelming. The sheer abundance of it. The fat, the salt, the richness, all the things their bodies have been screaming for through months of inadequate nutrition. Russell serves them himself, not requiring them to serve themselves like prisoners at a chow line. He places the plates before each general with the care of a host, not the disdain of a captor. "Please," he says, "eat." Yamashita picks up his fork. His hands, he notices with some shame, are shaking slightly. Not from fear, he's long past fear, but from something else. Anticipation? Hunger? The sheer cognitive dissonance of sitting at a formal dinner table in the home of an enemy who should, by all logic, despise him? He cuts a piece of beef. The meat yields easily, it's been cooked properly, slow roasted until tender. He places it in his mouth. The taste explodes across his palate, salt and savory fat, and the subtle sweetness of onions cooked down in meat drippings. For a moment, he closes his eyes. Not in ecstasy, but in the simple physical relief of eating real food after months of deprivation. Across the table, Homer's face remains a mask, but his fork moves steadily from plate to mouth with the methodical determination of a starving man trying to maintain dignity. The third general eats more quickly, less concerned with appearances, his body overriding his military bearing. Russell eats as well, but slowly, watching his guests. Not with the predatory observation of an interrogator, but with the quiet attention of a host ensuring his guests are satisfied. For the first few minutes, no one speaks. The only sounds are silverware on plates, the quiet murmur of chewing, the occasional scrape of a chair. The MPs by the wall watch, with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust to carefully maintained neutrality. Then Russell sets down his fork and speaks. "General Yamashita, do you have a family?" The interpreter translates. Yamashita, caught mid-bite, finishes chewing before responding. "A wife, a son, and a daughter. I have not heard from them since before the surrender. I'm sorry. That must be difficult." The simplicity of the statement, not an interrogation question, not a legal probe, but a simple acknowledgement of human difficulty, catches Yamashita off guard. For months, every American he's spoken to has been documenting his answers, building a case, cataloguing evidence for a trial. This man is asking about his children. "Do you have a family?" Yamashita asks, surprising himself with the question. "A wife. 2 boys, 7 and 9 years old now. Haven't seen them in 3 years." A nod of understanding passes between them. In this moment, they are not victor and vanquished, not war criminals and prosecutors, but two fathers separated from their children by a war neither of them started. The conversation deepens slowly, carefully. Russell asks about their military training, their peacetime experiences, the Japan they remember before the war. He doesn't ask about atrocities or command decisions. He doesn't probe for admissions or confessions. He asks about the human experiences around the war, not the war itself. Homer, initially suspicious, begins to respond with longer answers. He talks about his time as a military attaché in London in the 1930s, about watching British society prepare for a war everyone knew was coming. He talks about his wife, about his garden in Tokyo, about the cherry blossoms he hasn't seen in 4 years. The third general remains mostly silent, but his tension eases. He accepts second helpings when Russell offers. He drinks his coffee without the guarded watchfulness that marked the meal's beginning. But the war cannot be entirely avoided. It sits at the table with them, an uninvited guest too large to ignore. Russell, refilling coffee cups, finally addresses it directly. "General Yamashita, may I ask you something difficult?" Through the interpreter, "Yes. Did you know about what happened in Manila?" The room goes quiet. The MPs straighten slightly, hands moving fractionally closer to weapons. The interpreter's voice, translating, carries careful neutrality. Yamashita sets down his cup precisely, buying time to formulate his answer. When he speaks, his voice is steady, but something in his eyes suggests exhaustion beyond the physical. "I learned about it afterward, during the battle. My headquarters was in Baguio, more than 200 kilometers north. Admiral Iwabuchi commanded the naval forces in Manila. They did not answer to the army command." He pauses, then continues. "I ordered the city abandoned. Open city. No defense. Those orders are documented. The Americans have captured them." "Then why did he fight there?" "The Navy and the Army." Yamashita struggles to find words the interpreter can translate meaningfully. There was no unity of command. The naval forces considered the army orders suggestions, not directives. Iwabuchi believed defending Manila was a matter of honor. He was wrong, but you were the overall commander in the Philippines. Yes, the word falls like a stone. I was the commander. The responsibility is mine. It's not a legal defense. It's not an excuse. It's something more fundamental, a recognition that command carries burdens that transcend the narrow question of who ordered what. Yamashita is not claiming innocence. He's claiming something more complex, that a commander bears moral responsibility for his force's actions, even when he lacks direct control, even when his orders are ignored, even when the command structure itself has fractured. Russell nods slowly, digesting this. "I lost friends in Manila, good men, Americans and Filipinos. I am sorry." 2 words in English, spoken directly without waiting for translation. Inadequate and enormous. The silence that follows is not hostile, but it's heavy with the weight of 30,000 dead civilians, with the massacre at the hospital, with the women raped and killed in the streets, with all the horrors that have brought these men to this moment. Homer, who has been quiet during this exchange, suddenly speaks. "Why did you do this? Invite us here." Russell considers the question, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Where I come from, there's an old idea. If you feed your enemy, sometimes you make him your friend. Not always. But sometimes. You think we can be friends?" Homer's voice carries bitter skepticism. "I think you're men who made choices in a war. I think you're going to face trial, and probably be convicted, and probably be executed. And I think before that happens, you deserve one evening where someone treats you like human beings, not monsters." Are we not monsters? Yamashita asks quietly. The question seems directed as much at himself as at Russell. Russell sets down his cup and looks directly at Yamashita. I don't know. Maybe you are. Maybe anyone who commands in war becomes something monstrous. But I know that if I treat every enemy like a monster, if I forget that they're human beings who might have been decent men in different circumstances, then I become something I don't want to be. He pauses, then continues. My father taught me that how you treat a man who can't fight back tells you everything about your own character. You three can't fight back anymore. You're prisoners. You're going to die, probably. But before that happens, I want you to know that not every American is interested in revenge. Some of us still believe in mercy. The word mercy translates awkwardly into Japanese. The interpreter uses the word jihi, which carries religious connotations, Buddhist, implications of compassion that transcend justice. It's not quite what Russell meant, but it's close enough. Yamashita bows his head slightly. Thank you. This will be remembered. The meal continues. Dessert, canned peaches. Nothing fancy, but sweet and wet after months of bland food. More coffee. Conversation drifts back to safer topics, farming techniques, the differences between Iowa soil and Japanese soil, the challenge of growing rice versus growing corn. As the evening deepens, Russell asks one final question. Is there anything you'd like me to tell your families, if I could find a way to get a message through? Yamashita thinks for a long moment. Tell them I died as a soldier, with dignity. Homer echoes the sentiment. Tell them I was not cruel, that I did not intend what happened, but I accept responsibility. The third general simply says, tell them I thought of them at the end. Whether Russell ever attempted to deliver these messages is unknown. The historical record doesn't show any communication between him and the generals' families, but the fact that he asked, the fact that he offered, mattered in that moment. The dinner ends as it began, formal, careful, heavy with meaning that transcends the simple act of sharing food. The generals bow to Russell. He bows in return. The MPs escort them back to their cells, walking through Manila's darkened streets. Back in his cell, Yamashita lies on his cot, staring at the ceiling. The meal sits heavy in his stomach. He's eaten more in one evening than he typically ate in 3 days of prison rations. But it's not the fullness that keeps him awake. It's the cognitive dissonance. An American who lost friends in Manila, who had every reason to hate him, instead offered dignity and a decent meal. He doesn't understand Americans. Even after years of studying them, even after fighting them, even after surrendering to them, they remain fundamentally alien, capable of both great cruelty and great kindness, sometimes in the same breath. The same nation that firebombed Tokyo and incinerated Hiroshima also produces men like Russell, who offer pot roast to war criminals. If they had understood this sooner, this capacity for both ruthlessness and mercy, perhaps the war would have ended differently. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the war was always going to end this way, with Japan defeated and its generals awaiting trial. But for one evening, Yamashita was not a war criminal or a defeated enemy. He was a guest at a farmer's table, treated with the basic dignity that human beings owe one another. The trials would come, the verdicts would come, the sentences would come, but tonight he'd been given a gift he didn't expect and couldn't fully comprehend, the knowledge that even in the midst of justice, mercy could still exist. The machinery of justice begins turning long before the dinner, but it accelerates rapidly afterward. On September 17, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur issued a directive establishing military commissions to try Japanese war criminals. The legal framework is unprecedented. These will not be courts-martial under traditional military law. but special tribunals created specifically to adjudicate crimes that existing law struggles to categorize. The challenge facing American legal minds in the autumn of 1945 is fundamental. How do you prosecute a commander for atrocities he didn't personally commit, might not have ordered, and possibly didn't even know about until after they occurred? Traditional military justice requires direct culpability, a clear chain of command from order to execution. But the massacres in Manila, the Bataan Death March, the countless smaller atrocities across the Pacific Theater, many of these happened in the chaos of retreat, in the breakdown of command structures, in the fog of war where orders get lost and subordinates act on their own initiative. The American prosecutors, led by Chief Counsel Colonel Robert Brown, develop a novel legal theory: command responsibility. A commander is responsible not only for what he orders, but for what he fails to prevent. If a reasonable commander should have known about atrocities committed by his forces, and if he possessed the means to prevent or punish those atrocities, then his failure to act makes him culpable. It's elegant in theory. In practice, it will prove one of the most controversial legal doctrines of the 20th century. Yamashita's trial is scheduled first, October 29, 1945. The date is chosen deliberately 4 years and 22 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, a symbolic reminder of how this war began. The venue is the ballroom of the Philippine High Commissioner's residence in Manila, hastily converted into a courtroom. 5 American generals will serve as the military commission, the judges, jury, and arbiters of both fact and law. The prosecution's case is straightforward. Yamashita commanded all Japanese forces in the Philippines from October 1944 through August 1945. During that period, his forces committed widespread atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war. As the commanding general, he bears responsibility for these crimes, whether or not he directly ordered them. The evidence is overwhelming in its horror. Witnesses testify to systematic massacres. Photographs document burned hospitals, executed prisoners, mutilated corpses. Survivors describe bayonettings, rapes, torture. The prosecution introduces evidence of 123 separate incidents involving atrocities against civilians and prisoners. The death toll Filipino civilians alone exceeds 100,000. Yamashita's defense, led by American military lawyers appointed by MacArthur, argues a different narrative. Yes, atrocities occurred. Yes, they were horrific, but Yamashita did not order them. More importantly, he could not have prevented them. The defense presents evidence that by late 1944, Yamashita's command was fragmenting. American air superiority had destroyed most communication infrastructure. Radio traffic was monitored and bombed. Courier routes were interdicted. Yamashita's headquarters in the mountains of northern Luzon was effectively isolated from Manila, from the Visayas, from the dozens of scattered pockets of Japanese resistance across the archipelago. Moreover, the defense argues, the worst atrocities in Manila were committed by naval forces under Rear Admiral Iwabuchi, who explicitly rejected Yamashita's authority. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated under separate command structures. Inter-service rivalry, particularly the Navy's contempt for what they saw as army defeatism, meant that Iwabuchi ignored Yamashita's orders to abandon Manila. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The prosecution counters with the command responsibility doctrine. Ignorance is not innocence. A commander's duty is to know what his forces are doing. If communications are broken, he must restore them. If subordinates are disobeying orders, he must enforce discipline. If atrocities are occurring, he must take active steps to prevent them. Yamashita's failure to do any of these things, even if hindered by circumstances, constitutes criminal negligence. The trial lasts 6 weeks. Witness after witness describes horrors. The courtroom fills with testimony about children bayoneted in front of their parents, women raped and mutilated, hospitals deliberately burned with patients inside. The photographs are graphic enough that some commission members visibly recoil. Through it all, Yamashita sits in the defendant's chair, impassive. He testifies in his own defense, speaking through interpreters, carefully explaining the chaos of the Philippines campaign, the breakdown of command and control, and his explicit orders to preserve Manila. But the prosecution's cross-examination is brutal, forcing him to acknowledge that yes, he was the commanding general, yes, these were technically his forces, yes. The buck stops with the commander. On December 7th, 1945, exactly 4 years after Pearl Harbor, the military commission delivered its verdict: guilty. The sentence: death by hanging. The symbolism is deliberate, heavy-handed, and legally irrelevant. Justice, in this case, operates on multiple levels simultaneously: legal precedent, political necessity, and emotional catharsis for a war that claimed millions of lives. Yamashita's lawyers immediately appeal, arguing that the command responsibility doctrine violates fundamental principles of American military justice. The case goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. On February 4, 1946, the court issued its decision in Yamashita v. Steyer. The majority opinion, written by Chief Justice Harlan, Stone, upholds the conviction. Commanders have a duty to control their troops. Failure to do so, especially when atrocities are widespread and systematic, constitutes criminal negligence. The command responsibility doctrine stands, but the dissents are scathing. Justice Frank Murphy writes, "The Fifth Amendment guarantee of due process of law applies to any person who is accused of a crime by the federal government or any of its agencies. No exception is made as to those who are accused of war crimes or as to those who possess the status of an enemy belligerent." More prophetically, Murphy continues, "Indeed, such a precedent of full reparation of the forms of due process may always be found useful to those who have no desire to give effect to the Constitution. The failure to provide adequate counsel and a fair trial would not be overlooked so readily if we were to try in our own courts members of our own armed forces. We ought not now to set a precedent which might later be used to justify the trial of American soldiers in such a summary and unfair manner." Justice Wiley Rutledge's dissent goes further, questioning whether the military commission had jurisdiction at all, whether the charges were sufficiently specific, and whether the command responsibility doctrine might apply to American commanders whose subordinates committed atrocities in the heat of battle. But dissents don't overturn convictions. The sentence stands. While Yamashita's appeal works through the courts, Masaharu Homma faces his own tribunal. The charges stem from the Bataan Death March and the subsequent treatment of American and Filipino prisoners at Camp O'Donnell. Homma's trial began in January 1946. The prosecution's case is built on survivor testimony. American soldiers who endured the march, who watched their comrades beaten, bayoneted, or shot for falling behind. Filipino civilians who witnessed the column of sick, starving prisoners stumbling north under guard. Medics who tried to treat men dying from dysentery, malnutrition, and untreated wounds. The numbers are devastating. Of the approximately 75,000 prisoners who began the march, at least 5,000 died during the march itself. Another 20,000 died in the first 2 months at Camp O'Donnell, from disease, starvation, and continued abuse. The death rate among American prisoners approached 25% within the first few months of captivity. Homa's defense mirrors Yamashita's. He did not order the abuse. He did not authorize the executions. He was focused on continuing operations against Corregidor, the island fortress in Manila Bay that continued to resist after Bataan fell. By the time he learned about conditions on the march and at the camps, the damage was done. The defense presents evidence that Homa actually issued orders for proper treatment of prisoners. Documents show requisitions for food, medicine, and transportation for the POWs. Testimony from some of Homa's staff officers suggests he was genuinely unaware of the severity of conditions until weeks after the surrender. But again, the prosecution invokes command responsibility. A commander who issues orders but fails to ensure their execution is still culpable. A commander who requisitions supplies but doesn't verify their delivery bears responsibility for the consequences. Ignorance of conditions under his command constitutes negligence, not innocence. The military commission deliberates for a shorter time than in Yamashita's case. February 11, 1946. Guilty. The sentence: death by firing squad. Homa does not appeal. Perhaps he recognizes the futility. Perhaps, on some level, he accepts the verdict. He writes letters to his wife in Tokyo, letters that speak of regret, of dishonor, of accepting responsibility for failures of command, even if not for deliberate cruelty. One letter, later published, contains a passage that haunts: "I was not a cruel man. I did not order the suffering, but I was the commander, and the suffering happened under my command. Perhaps there is no difference, in the end, between ordering evil and failing to prevent it." The third general, whose name remains frustratingly obscure in most English-language sources, faces trial on similar charges. His case lacks the prominence of Yamashita's or Homa's, but the pattern is the same. Atrocities committed by forces under his command, charges of command responsibility, conviction, sentence of death. What links all three cases is the legal innovation or legal overreach, depending on perspective of the command responsibility doctrine. Prior to these trials, military law generally required proof of direct culpability. A commander could be held responsible for orders he gave, but not necessarily for actions taken by subordinates without his knowledge or authorization. The Pacific War tribunals change this calculus. They establish that command itself carries responsibilities that transcend direct orders. A commander must actively work to prevent atrocities, must maintain discipline, must establish and enforce standards of conduct. Failure to do so, even in the chaos of warfare, even with broken communications, even with subordinates who ignore orders, constitutes criminal negligence. The implications ripple outward immediately. At Nuremberg, where Nazi leaders faced trial for crimes against humanity, the command responsibility doctrine provides a legal framework for prosecuting military commanders who claim they didn't know about concentration camps or mass executions. If Japanese generals can be held responsible for atrocities they didn't order, then German generals can be held responsible for the Holocaust that occurred in their operational theaters. The doctrine became enshrined in the Geneva Conventions, revised and expanded in the years after the war. It shapes the creation of the International Criminal Court. It's invoked in prosecutions following the Yugoslav wars, the Rwandan genocide, the conflicts in Sierra Leone and Liberia. But it remains controversial precisely because of cases like Yamashita's, where the commander explicitly ordered the opposite of what occurred, where communications were demonstrably broken, where inter-service rivalries meant effective command and control had collapsed. The question that haunts military lawyers and ethicists for the next 7 decades: where is the line between negligence and impossibility? At what point does the fog of war become an excuse for failing to prevent atrocities? And who decides? February 23, 1946, Los Baños Prison, 40 miles south of Manila. Tomoyuki Yamashita wakes before dawn, as he has every morning of his military career. The cell is dark, humid, already warm despite the early hour. He performs his morning routine, such as it can be in a prison cell, with the same precision he brought to command. Wash face, straighten uniform, sit in correct posture. Today is the day. An American chaplain comes to his cell, offering final prayers. Yamashita declines. He is not a Christian, and while he respects the chaplain's intentions, there seems little point in seeking comfort from a God he doesn't believe in. Instead, he meditates in the manner he learned as a young officer, trying to achieve some measure of inner calm before what comes next. At 7 a.m., the guards come. The walk to the gallows is short, the execution site is within the prison compound. Yamashita walks steadily, back straight, head up. Whatever fear he feels remains invisible to observers. The gallows is a simple military construction, wood frame, trapdoor, rope, efficient and unglamorous. American soldiers line the execution ground, witnesses to what military justice looks like in the aftermath of total war. Yamashita is offered a blindfold. He accepts. Final words are translated. He speaks briefly in Japanese. I will pray for the Emperor's long life and for the peace and prosperity of my country. No apology, no plea for mercy, just a soldier's final statement concerned with nation and duty to the end. The noose is placed around his neck. The chaplain reads final prayers. At 7:23 a.m., the trapdoor opens. Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, conqueror of Singapore, commander of the 14th Area Army, dies at the end of an American rope for atrocities he did not order but failed to prevent. His body is left hanging for the prescribed time, then cut down and buried in an unmarked grave. Even in death, there is no honor for a convicted war criminal, no monument, no ceremony, just disposal. April 3, 1946. Outside Manila, Masaharu Homa faces a different execution. The firing squad assembles in early morning light 12 American soldiers with rifles, all but one loaded with live ammunition. The traditional arrangement allows each soldier to believe he might have fired the blank, distributing psychological burden. Homa refuses a blindfold. He wants to see his executioners, wants to face death with open eyes. He stands before a post, hands tied behind his back, wearing his uniform without insignia or decorations, a defeated general, stripped of rank and honor. The officer in charge reads the conviction and sentence. Homa listens through an interpreter, his face expressionless. When asked if he has final words, he speaks briefly. I have fought fairly for my country. I am satisfied with my service. The firing squad raises rifles. The officer drops his sword, the signal to fire. 12 rifles discharge almost simultaneously. Homa's body jerks, slumps against the post, then slides to the ground. Medics approach, verify death, remove the body. Like Yamashita, Homa is buried in an unmarked grave. His family in Japan will learn of his execution through official notification, but won't receive his body for burial. That won't happen until years later, after the occupation ends, and Japanese families begin the process of recovering their executed war criminals for proper cremation and memorial. The night before his execution, Homa wrote his final letter home. It contained the passage about the dinner with the American farmer, the pot roast, the brief moment of humanity extended by an enemy. He couldn't explain why that memory mattered so much in his final hours, only that it did. That for one evening he'd been treated like a human being rather than a monster, and that knowledge made dying slightly easier. The third general's execution date and method, unspecified in most sources, follows the same pattern: conviction, appeal, if any, rejection, execution, unmarked grave. His story dissolves into the mass of war crimes tribunals that processed hundreds of Japanese officers and officials in the years following surrender. By the end of 1946, more than 5,000 Japanese have been tried for war crimes. Nearly 1,000 are executed. Thousands more receive prison sentences ranging from a few years to life. The tribunals continue through 1948, processing cases from Manila to Tokyo, from Singapore to Rabaul. The patterns repeat: atrocities documented, commanders charged, command responsibility invoked, convictions secured, sentences carried out. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, processes defendants with bureaucratic efficiency. But each trial, each conviction, each execution raises the same uncomfortable questions. Where is the line between command and chaos? How much control must a commander have to be held responsible for subordinates' actions? Can impossibility, the genuine inability to prevent atrocities due to circumstances beyond control, ever be a defense? The tribunals consistently answer, no. Command carries absolute responsibility. A commander who cannot control his forces should not be in command. Therefore, failure to prevent atrocities constitutes at minimum negligence, at worst, tacit authorization. It's a harsh standard. Critics argue it's an impossible standard, one that condemns commanders for failures that might have been genuinely unavoidable. Defenders argue that without such a standard, commanders can evade responsibility by deliberately maintaining ignorance or by engineering plausible deniability. The debate continues to this day. What happened to Russell? This is where the story becomes frustratingly fragmentary. Unlike the generals whose trials were meticulously documented, whose executions were officially recorded, whose fates are matters of historical record, Russell disappears from the archives after the dinner. What we know comes from scattered sources, post-war interviews with soldiers who served in the occupation, oral histories collected decades later, occasional references in memoirs and letters. The picture that emerges is incomplete but suggestive. Russell returned to the United States in late 1946, after his service obligation ended. He went back to farming Iowa, according to some sources, though others suggest Nebraska or Kansas. The Midwest, certainly. Corn and soybeans, livestock, the rhythms of agricultural life that predate and outlast wars. He married whether to the wife he mentioned at dinner or to someone else. The sources don't clarify. He had children or stepchildren. He worked his land, participated in his community, attended church, lived the quiet life of rural America in the post-war boom years. He never spoke publicly about the dinner with the Japanese generals. No interviews, no articles in the local paper, no testimony at the trials. When the verdicts came down, when the executions were carried out, there's no record of his reaction. A neighbor, interviewed in the 1980s for a local history project, remembered Russell as a quiet man who didn't talk much about his war service. Most of the veterans didn't, back then. The neighbor said, "You came home, you went back to work, you didn't dwell on it." But Russell, he seemed to carry something heavier than most. Not guilt, exactly. More like, sadness, like he'd seen something he couldn't shake. Another acquaintance remembered Russell saying once, at a farm equipment auction in the 1950s, something about treating enemies with dignity. The context is lost. The acquaintance couldn't remember what prompted the comment, but the phrase stuck. You treat a man with dignity, even if he's your enemy, even if he's done terrible things, because if you don't, you lose something of yourself. That might be apocryphal. Memory is unreliable, especially decades after the fact, but it sounds like something Russell might have said, based on what we know of his actions in September 1945. The most detailed account comes from a letter discovered in the 1990s, written by Russell to a fellow veteran in 1953. The letter discusses various aspects of post-war adjustment, the difficulty of explaining military service to civilians who weren't there, and the persistent nightmares that many veterans experienced. In one passage, Russell writes, I keep thinking about those 3 Japanese generals I gave dinner to in Manila. They were executed a few months later. I knew that would happen when I invited them. Everybody knew. The trials were formalities. The verdicts were predetermined by what their armies had done. But I felt like somebody needed to show them that Americans could be merciful even when we were being just, that we could hold men accountable for their crimes and still treat them like human beings in their final days. I don't know if I did the right thing. Some of the other soldiers thought I was crazy, or worse, that I was sympathizing with the enemy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that how we treat our defeated enemies says as much about us as it does about them. The pot roast didn't save them. Maybe nothing could have saved them. Maybe they didn't deserve to be saved. But for one evening, I wanted them to know that not every American was interested in revenge, that some of us still believed in treating even our enemies with basic dignity. I think about that dinner sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. I wonder if it mattered, if they thought about it before they died, if it changed anything at all. Probably not. But I'm glad I did it anyway. The letter provides the clearest window into Russell's thinking, his motivations, and his post-war reflections. He's not claiming moral superiority. He's not arguing that the generals were innocent. He's simply saying that mercy and justice can coexist, that you can hold someone accountable for their crimes while still treating them with basic human dignity. It's a profoundly American idea, rooted in the same soil that produced Lincoln's "with malice toward none, with charity for all," and the Marshall Plan that rebuilt defeated enemies into allies. The belief that even in war, even in the midst of justified anger and righteous punishment, there remains space for mercy. Russell lived into the 1970s, dying of natural causes on his farm. His obituary in the local paper made brief mention of his military service in the Pacific, but said nothing about the dinner with Japanese generals. That story emerged only later, pieced together from fragmentary sources by historians trying to understand the human dimensions of the post-war occupation. The command responsibility doctrine established in the Yamashita trial became one of the foundational principles of modern international law. It's incorporated into the Geneva Conventions. It shapes the Rome Statute that creates the International Criminal Court. It's invoked in virtually every major war crimes prosecution from Nuremberg forward. But it remains controversial precisely because of cases like Yamashita's, where the gap between command, responsibility, and effective control creates impossible situations. Can a commander genuinely be held responsible for atrocities committed by subordinates over whom he has lost practical control? At what point does the doctrine become a tool for punishing defeat rather than prosecuting genuine culpability? The debate intensified during the Vietnam War, when American commanders faced questions about atrocities committed by subordinates. The My Lai massacre, where American soldiers killed hundreds of Vietnamese civilians, raised the Yamashita precedent in disturbing ways. If Japanese generals could be executed for failing to prevent atrocities committed by forces under their nominal command, could American generals be held to the same standard? Captain Ernest Medina, Lieutenant William Calley's company commander during the My Lai massacre, was tried under the command responsibility doctrine. He was acquitted. The military court found that he neither ordered nor had sufficient knowledge of the massacre to be held responsible. But the trial itself demonstrated that the Yamashita precedent cuts both ways. More recently, the doctrine has been invoked in prosecutions at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where Serbian commanders were convicted for failing to prevent massacres committed by subordinate units during the Bosnian War. It was central to prosecutions at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, holding commanders responsible for genocide committed by forces under their command. The tension remains unresolved. How much control must a commander have to be held responsible? What constitutes reasonable efforts to prevent atrocities? Can impossibility, genuine, demonstrable impossibility rather than convenient ignorance, ever be a defense? These questions don't have easy answers. They persist in every conflict, in every war crimes prosecution, in every attempt to establish accountability for mass atrocities. The Yamashita precedent demands that commanders bear responsibility for their forces' actions, regardless of direct orders or knowledge. It sets a high standard, perhaps an impossibly high standard for command accountability. But that standard exists precisely because of what happened when commanders claimed ignorance. The Holocaust occurred in operational theaters controlled by Wehrmacht commanders who later claimed they didn't know about concentration camps literally miles from their headquarters. The rape of Nanjing occurred under the nominal command of Japanese generals who claimed not to know about systematic massacres happening in a city they occupied. Ignorance became the universal excuse. The command responsibility doctrine was designed to eliminate that excuse, to establish that commanders have an affirmative duty to know what their forces are doing and to prevent atrocities. Whether it succeeds in establishing genuine accountability or simply provides legal cover for punishing defeated enemies remains debated by military lawyers, historians, and ethicists decades after Yamashita's execution. In Tokyo, Yamashita's family received official notification of his execution in March 1946. His wife, Hisako, lived another 35 years, dying in 1981. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly about her husband's conviction or execution, maintaining the stoic dignity expected of Japanese military wives. But she kept letters he'd written from prison, including one that mentioned the dinner with the American soldier. Yamashita wrote, "Tonight I experienced something I did not expect. An American showed me kindness, not interrogation, not legal maneuvering, but simple human kindness. He gave me a meal and asked about my family. I do not understand why, but I am grateful. It reminds me that even in the midst of war and its aftermath, human decency can still exist." The letter was discovered after Hisako's death, among her personal effects. It's one of the few surviving first-hand accounts of the dinner, written by one of the participants rather than reconstructed from second-hand sources. Homa's family received similar notification of his execution. His letters home, including the one mentioning the pot roast dinner, were eventually published in Japan in the 1960s, part of a broader Japanese effort to document the Tokyo trials and the various war crimes tribunals. The dinner became a minor footnote in Japanese accounts of the occupation, an example of individual American decency amid what many Japanese viewed as victor's justice. The third general's family, assuming they were located and notified, left no records in English-language sources. His story dissolves into the mass of executed war criminals, names on lists, bodies in unmarked graves, families mourning men who died far from home for crimes they may or may not have committed with full awareness. By the early 1950s, the occupation of Japan had ended. The last war crimes, prisoners had been released or executed. The focus shifted from punishment to reconstruction, from accountability to alliance. The Cold War created new priorities. Communist expansion, not Japanese militarism, became the primary concern. Some of the surviving convicted war criminals were released early, their sentences commuted as part of broader American policy to rehabilitate Japan as a bulwark against communism in Asia. Men sentenced to life imprisonment found themselves freed after serving 7 or 10 years. The logic was pragmatic. Yesterday's enemies might be tomorrow's allies, and old grudges had to give way to new strategic realities. This pragmatism troubled some of the surviving victims. Filipino civilians who'd lost families in the Manila massacre, American veterans who'd survived the Bataan Death March they watched as Japanese war criminals returned to civilian life, some even re-entering public service. The apparent injustice of shortened sentences for documented atrocities created lasting resentment. But the Cold War was unforgiving of sentiment. Strategic necessity trumped emotional satisfaction. Japan needed to be rebuilt, rearmed, and integrated into the American alliance system. Continuing to prosecute or imprison Japanese war criminals interfered with that objective. By the mid-1950s, the War Crimes Tribunal era had ended. The last prisoners were released. The last appeals were resolved. The machinery of post-war justice, which had seemed so urgent and necessary in 1945, was dismantled and forgotten. What remained was precedent. The command responsibility doctrine, established in blood and controversy, became foundational to international humanitarian law. The principle that commanders bear responsibility for their forces' actions, regardless of direct orders or knowledge, survived long after the tribunals that established it had closed. And somewhere on a farm in the American Midwest, a man named Russell worked his land, raised his family, and occasionally remembered 3 Japanese generals who'd expected execution but received pot roast instead. Whether that dinner changed anything, whether it mattered in any measurable way, is impossible to say. The generals were executed anyway. The trials proceeded according to predetermined conclusions. Justice, such as it was, followed its course regardless of one farmer's gesture of mercy. But Russell believed it mattered. He believed that how we treat our enemies, especially defeated enemies who can no longer resist, reveals something fundamental about our own character. He believed that mercy and justice could coexist, that you could hold men accountable for their crimes while still acknowledging their humanity. That belief, that simple, stubborn insistence on maintaining basic human dignity, even in the midst of prosecuting war crimes, represents something profoundly important, not because it changed the outcome, not because it saved anyone, but because it demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, individual acts of decency remain possible. The pot roast didn't matter to the military commissions or the Supreme Court or the executioners who carried out the sentences. But it mattered to 3 men facing death, and it mattered to the American soldier who offered it. Sometimes that's enough. The spring of 1946 brought change to Manila. American occupation forces began drawdown operations, preparing for the Philippines' full independence, scheduled for July 4th. The country had been promised independence before the war delayed by the Japanese invasion, now finally arriving in a nation devastated by 3 years of occupation and 6 months of brutal liberation. The city rebuilding efforts focused on practical necessities, restoring power, clearing rubble, reopening the port. But some destruction went deeper than damaged infrastructure. The psychological wounds, the trauma of massacre, the memory of neighbors turning on neighbors during the occupation, the complicated legacy of collaboration and resistance, these would take generations to heal, if they ever did. The war crimes trials continued through 1946 and into 1947, processing defendants with assembly line efficiency. Japanese officers, Korean guards from prisoner of war camps, collaborators accused of helping the occupation authorities all faced military commissions that followed the precedents established in Yamashita's trial. The command responsibility doctrine, controversial as it remained, provided the legal framework for prosecuting hundreds of cases. Commanders who claimed ignorance of atrocities found their defenses rejected. Officers who argued they lacked effective control over subordinates were convicted anyway. The standard was clear. Command carries responsibility, regardless of circumstances. But away from the courtrooms, in the messy reality of human experience, the questions persisted. 3 American defense lawyers who'd represented Yamashita resigned their commissions in protest after his execution, arguing that the trial had been a legal farce designed to provide a veneer of justice to predetermined conclusions. Their resignations made news briefly, then were forgotten in the rush of post-war reconstruction. Justice Murphy's dissent in Yamashita v. Steyer became required reading in military law schools, studied as both warning and precedent. His prediction that American commanders might someday face similar charges under the doctrine established to convict Japanese generals proved prescient. Every subsequent American military action raised questions about command responsibility when subordinates committed atrocities. The doctrine created perverse incentives. Commanders learned to document their orders meticulously, creating paper trails that demonstrated they'd issued proper guidance. They held training sessions on proper paper, treatment of prisoners, on rules of engagement, on prohibitions against targeting civilians. Not necessarily because this prevented atrocities, though sometimes it did, but because documentation provided legal cover. The phrase, plausible deniability, entered military vocabulary. If you couldn't prevent atrocities, at least ensure you could demonstrate you'd tried. Document orders, record training. Maintain communication logs. Build the legal defense preemptively, because if atrocities occurred under your command, you would be held responsible. This wasn't the intention of the command responsibility doctrine. The intention was to create affirmative duty to force commanders to actively work to prevent atrocities rather than passively allowing them. But in practice, it often created incentives for careful documentation rather than actual prevention. The gap between legal theory and operational reality remained unbridgeable. In Japan, Yamashita's execution generated complex reactions. The official narrative promoted by the American occupation authorities and adopted by the new Japanese government held that militarist leaders had led the nation into a disastrous war of aggression. These leaders bore responsibility for both starting the war and for the atrocities committed during it. Their prosecution and punishment was necessary for Japan's transformation into a peaceful democracy. But private sentiment was more complicated. Many Japanese viewed Yamashita as a competent professional soldier who'd done his duty under impossible circumstances. His explicit orders to preserve Manila, his documented attempts to fight a defensive campaign that minimized civilian casualties, His surrender when further resistance became pointless. These suggested a man trying to wage war according to civilized standards. However much war itself resisted civilization. The perception grew that Yamashita had been executed not for what he'd done, but for what others had done in his name. That he'd been sacrificed to satisfy American desire for vengeance, to demonstrate Japanese subordination, to establish legal precedents that had less to do with his actual culpability than with broader post-war objectives. This perception fed into what would become a persistent Japanese narrative about the Pacific War, that Japan had fought a war of self-defense against Western imperialism, that ordinary Japanese soldiers had behaved no worse than soldiers of other nations, and that the war crimes trials represented victors' justice rather than genuine accountability. The narrative was, at best, half true. Japan had committed documented atrocities across Asia, the rape of Nanjing, the systematic abuse of comfort women, the brutal treatment of prisoners of war, the medical experimentation on Chinese civilians, the massacres in Manila and Singapore, and dozens of other locations. These weren't isolated incidents by rogue units, but patterns of behavior that reflected military, culture, and doctrine. But the narrative persisted because cases like Yamashita's, where the connection between commander and atrocity was attenuated, where orders had been explicitly contrary to what occurred, where conviction seemed driven more by legal innovation than factual culpability, provided a plausible foundation for broader claims of injustice. The dinner with Russell became, in some Japanese retellings, symbolic of this tension. An American soldier saw Yamashita as a human being, as someone worthy of basic dignity. But the American legal system saw him only as a symbol, as a defendant whose conviction was necessary regardless of individual culpability. Both perspectives contained truth. That's what made the story powerful and troubling and impossible to resolve into simple moral clarity. The 1950s brought the Korean War, which demonstrated the command responsibility doctrine's limitations when applied to American commanders. When American forces retreated during Chinese intervention in winter of 1950 to 1951, atrocities occurred on all sides. Chinese forces executed American prisoners. American forces killed South Korean civilians suspected of collaboration. South Korean forces massacred suspected communist sympathizers. American commanders were not prosecuted under the Yamashita precedent. The circumstances were different: active combat operations, rapidly changing front lines, fog of war. But the parallels were uncomfortable enough that military legal advisors began quietly reassessing the doctrine's application. The same pattern repeated in Vietnam. The My Lai massacre in 1968 raised explicit questions about command responsibility. Lieutenant William Calley was convicted of murder. Captain Ernest Medina, his company commander, was tried but acquitted. Higher-level commanders up through the chain to General William Westmoreland were never charged, though they commanded forces operating in an environment where atrocities against civilians were documented. The asymmetry was obvious. Japanese generals were executed for failing to prevent atrocities committed by forces under their nominal command. American officers faced at most court-martial, and usually not even that. The difference couldn't be explained purely by legal distinctions about command and control. It reflected who was writing the rules and who was being judged by them. This doesn't mean Yamashita was innocent. The evidence of widespread atrocities committed by Japanese forces in the Philippines was overwhelming and undeniable. His failure to prevent them, whether through inability or negligence, represented a catastrophic failure of command. But it does mean that the legal standard applied to him was both unprecedented and selectively enforced. And that selective enforcement undermined the claim that these were trials about universal principles of justice rather than exercises in victor's prerogative. Russell's letter from 1953, discovered decades later, provides insight into how at least one participant viewed the dinner's significance. "I've been thinking about the difference between justice and revenge. They can look similar from the outside, both involve punishing people who've done wrong, but the motivation is different, and I think the method should be different too. Revenge is personal. It's about making someone suffer because they made you suffer. It's satisfying emotionally, but it doesn't really accomplish anything except spreading pain around. Justice is supposed to be impersonal. It's about establishing rules and holding people accountable when they break those rules. It's not about emotion, it's about principle. But here's the thing. Justice administered without mercy becomes indistinguishable from revenge. If you strip away a person's humanity completely, if you treat them as nothing more than a symbol of evil that needs to be destroyed, then you're not really pursuing justice anymore. You're just dressing up as revenge in legal language. I wanted those three generals to know that Americans could pursue justice, real justice, holding them accountable for failures of command that led to horrible atrocities while still recognizing they were human beings. That we could prosecute them, convict them, execute them if necessary, but still treat them with basic dignity in their final days. Looking back, I'm not sure I succeeded. The trials went forward. The convictions were probably inevitable. The executions happened on schedule. Nothing I did changed any of that. But for one evening, those three men sat at a table and were treated like humans instead of monsters. They ate a decent meal. They talked about their families. They were shown mercy, even though they were going to face justice. I can't explain why that matters, but I know it does. I know that if we lose the ability to see our enemies as human beings, even when we're holding them accountable for inhuman actions, then we've lost something essential. The pot roast didn't save them, but maybe it saved something in me. Maybe it saved the idea that justice and mercy can coexist. The letter circulated among military historians in the 1990s, prompting renewed interest in the post-war tribunals and the human dimensions of occupation justice. A few articles were published in military law journals, examining the dinner as a case study in the tension between legal accountability and human compassion. But the story never became widely known. It remained a footnote, an anecdote, a small human moment in the vast machinery of war crimes, prosecution. Perhaps that's appropriate. Grand historical forces, the tribunals, the legal precedents, the executions, these shape the future. But individual human moments, a dinner shared between enemies, a gesture of dignity extended to the defeated, these shape how we understand ourselves. By the early 21st century, the command responsibility doctrine had become thoroughly embedded in international humanitarian law. The International Criminal Court's founding statute explicitly incorporates it. Military commanders around the world receive training on their legal obligations to prevent atrocities by subordinates. The doctrine has been invoked in prosecutions following conflicts in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Cambodia. It's been cited in cases involving systematic rape as a weapon of war, the use of child soldiers, and ethnic cleansing campaigns. In some cases, the prosecutions seem clearly justified. Commanders who deliberately created environments where atrocities were encouraged, who fostered cultures of violence against civilians, who rewarded subordinates for brutal behavior, these commanders bore obvious responsibility for the resulting atrocities. But in other cases, the doctrine's application remains controversial. Commanders who issued proper, orders but lacked means to enforce them, commanders whose subordinates explicitly defied directives, commanders who operated in environments where traditional command and control had broken down completely. The Yamashita precedent looms over all these cases. If he could be convicted for atrocities committed by forces he explicitly ordered not to commit them, if his lack of effective control was deemed legally irrelevant, then virtually any commander whose forces commit atrocities can be held responsible. This creates the deterrent effect the doctrine's proponents seek. Commanders must actively work to prevent atrocities, must maintain discipline, must enforce standards. The threat of prosecution incentivizes proper conduct, but it also creates what critics call an impossible standard, one that holds commanders responsible for circumstances genuinely beyond their control, that criminalizes military defeat itself, that provides a legal framework for punishing the losers of conflicts. Regardless of individual culpability, the debate continues. In universities, in military academies, in international law conferences, no consensus has emerged. Perhaps none is possible. What remains clear is that the command responsibility doctrine, established in Manila in 1945 during the trial of Tomoyuki Yamashita, fundamentally reshaped how the international community thinks about accountability for war crimes. For better or worse, it established that command itself carries obligations that transcend direct orders, that ignorance cannot excuse atrocity, that leaders must answer for what happens under their authority. The physical evidence of these events has mostly disappeared. New Bilibid prison still exists, but it's been rebuilt multiple times. The house where Russell hosted the dinner was likely demolished during Manila's post-war reconstruction. Los Baños prison, where Yamashita was executed, is now part of a college campus. The execution sites, the courtrooms, the cells where the condemned awaited their fate, most of these places have been repurposed or destroyed. What remains are documents, trial transcripts, thousands of pages detailing charges, testimony, evidence, verdicts, military commission records documenting the procedures and legal theories applied, Supreme Court opinions analyzing the constitutional questions, letters from the condemned to their families, occasional mentions in memoirs and oral histories, and in these documents, occasionally, brief references to small human moments that don't fit neatly into the legal narratives, a dinner shared between enemies, an American farmer who offered pot roast to generals facing execution, a gesture of mercy that changed nothing about the outcome but perhaps changed something about the meaning. These moments don't feature in the grand historical narratives. They don't appear in textbook accounts of the Pacific War's end or the establishment of international humanitarian law. They're footnotes at best, curiosities that don't affect the main story. But they matter because they remind us that even in the midst of establishing accountability for mass atrocities, even in the necessary work of prosecuting war criminals, even in the harsh administration of justice, human decency remains possible. Russell's gesture didn't save anyone. The trials proceeded. The verdicts came down guilty. The executions were carried out on schedule. The command responsibility doctrine was established and became foundational to international law. But 3 men facing death were given one evening of dignity. They were served a meal. They were asked about their families. They were treated as human beings rather than monsters, even though the legal system was simultaneously categorizing them as monsters who had to be destroyed. This paradox that we can hold people accountable for monstrous actions while still recognizing their humanity is essential to justice that doesn't degrade into mere revenge. If we can only prosecute war criminals by first dehumanizing them completely, by reducing them to symbols of evil, rather than recognizing them as humans who made terrible choices, then our justice becomes suspect. Not because the guilty don't deserve punishment. They do. The atrocities committed by Japanese forces in the Philippines and across Asia were real, documented, horrific. The victims deserve accountability. The dead deserve remembrance. The survivors deserve recognition that what happened to them was wrong and that those responsible faced consequences. But accountability without humanity risks becoming indistinguishable from revenge. And revenge, however satisfying emotionally, doesn't actually accomplish the goals we claim for justice, deterrence, rehabilitation, restoration, establishment of moral and legal principles. Russell understood this intuitively. He wasn't a lawyer or a philosopher or a moral theorist. He was a farmer from the Midwest who believed that how you treat people who can't fight back reveals your character. He believed mercy and justice could coexist. He believed that even condemned war criminals deserved one evening of basic human dignity before facing the consequences of their actions. History vindicated neither the generals nor their executioners completely. The command responsibility doctrine established in Yamashita's trial remains controversial. The executions are still debated. Were they just punishment for genuine culpability or legal scapegoating of defeated commanders? But Russell's gesture offering pot roast and conversation to men facing execution requires no vindication. It was simply right. Right not because it changed anything, but because maintaining human decency in the midst of necessary punishment is itself valuable. Today, when the International Criminal Court prosecutes war criminals, when military tribunals consider command responsibility, when we debate how to hold leaders accountable for atrocities committed by those under their authority, the shadow of Yamashita's trial falls across these discussions. The legal precedents established in Manila in 1945 shape how we think about accountability, about command, about the obligations leaders bear for their subordinates' actions. These precedents have been refined, modified, debated, but never fully repudiated. And somewhere in those discussions, occasionally, someone mentions the dinner, the American farmer who invited condemned generals to share a meal, the gesture of mercy that coexisted with the administration of justice. It's a small story. It changed nothing about the outcome, but it suggests that even in our darkest necessities, prosecuting war criminals, executing the guilty, establishing accountability for mass atrocities, we need not abandon the human values that make justice meaningful rather than mere revenge. 3 Japanese generals walked to a requisitioned house in Manila on a September evening in 1945, expecting perhaps a final interrogation, perhaps a reading of charges, perhaps the beginning of the end. Instead, they were served pot roast. They were asked about their families. They were treated, for one evening, as human beings rather than monsters. A few months later, they were dead executed for crimes they committed or failed to prevent, depending on your interpretation of command responsibility and culpability. Both things are true. They faced justice. They received mercy. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. But for one evening they were guests at a table rather than prisoners in a cell. That combination, accountability and humanity, justice and mercy, punishment and dignity, represents something essential to civilization itself. The recognition that even those who've done terrible things remain human, that even necessary punishment should be administered with consciousness of human worth, that justice without mercy degrades into something less than just. Russell never claimed his dinner changed the world. He never argued it should have affected the trial's outcomes. He just believed it needed to be done, that someone needed to demonstrate that American justice, even when harsh, even when final, could still be administered with humanity. Whether he succeeded is for others to judge. But the fact that he tried that in the midst of war crimes, tribunals and executions, a farmer from Iowa took time to cook pot roast for condemned generals, that fact alone testifies to something important about human capacity for decency, even in circumstances that seem to demand nothing but hardness. The machinery of post-war justice ground through its cases with bureaucratic efficiency. Thousands tried, hundreds executed, thousands more imprisoned. The command-responsibility doctrine was established, shaping international law for generations. Justice, of a sort, was done, but justice administered without any recognition of human dignity risks becoming mere revenge dressed in legal robes. And revenge, however justified, however satisfying, doesn't actually accomplish what justice claims to achieve: the establishment of principles, the affirmation of human rights, the creation of standards that apply not just to the defeated but to everyone. Russell's pot roast didn't stop the executions, but it proved that even in executing justice, mercy remains possible, that we can hold people accountable for their failures while still recognizing their humanity, that the condemned deserve dignity even as they face consequences. These truths don't resolve the debates about command responsibility, about Yamashita's guilt or innocence, about whether the post-war tribunals represented genuine justice or victor's prerogative, but they remind us that even in the harshest necessities of holding leaders accountable for atrocities, we need not sacrifice the human values that distinguish justice from mere punishment, accountability from revenge, civilization from barbarism. 3 generals expected execution. They received a pot roast. Then they received execution. Both happened. Both mattered. And the fact that mercy preceded justice, that dignity was offered before punishment was administered, that human connection was possible even between enemies in the aftermath of atrocity, these facts suggest that even in our darkest moments, decency remains possible, not because it changes outcomes, but because maintaining humanity in the midst of necessary harshness is itself valuable, itself meaningful, itself essential to any justice worth the name. The dinner in September 1945 changed nothing about the trials or verdicts or executions that followed, but it changed something about what those trials and verdicts and executions meant, adding a dimension of mercy to justice, humanity to accountability, compassion to necessary punishment. That might not seem like much, but it's everything that separates civilization from barbarism, justice from revenge, punishment from cruelty. Russell went back to his farm. The generals went to their graves. The command responsibility doctrine became international law. The war ended, the occupation ended, life continued. But for one evening, enemies shared a meal. Mercy and justice coexisted. And 3 men facing death were reminded that even in the harshest calculations of accountability, human dignity could still matter. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that has to be enough. Because if we lose the capacity for mercy even while administering justice, if we can only prosecute war criminals by first dehumanizing them completely, if accountability requires abandoning every recognition of human worth, then what we gain in legal precedent, we lose in human principle. The pot roast didn't save anyone, but it proved that even in condemning war criminals, we need not become what we condemn. And 75 years later, that small gesture still resonates, a reminder that justice and mercy, accountability and humanity, punishment and dignity can coexist even in the aftermath of atrocity. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary, not because it changes everything, but because it preserves something essential. The dinner happened, the executions happened. Both are true, both matter. And the fact that we can hold both truths simultaneously, that condemned war criminals deserve both accountability and dignity, both justice and mercy, suggests something hopeful about human capacity for moral complexity, even in circumstances that seem to demand only hardness. Russell offered pot roast to men who would soon hang for atrocities they failed to prevent. That act of simple humanity, unchanged and unchanging across decades, stands as testimony to the possibility of mercy even in the midst of necessary justice. It changed nothing. It meant everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.